welcome to another episode of Bro History. It is Henry Zamota and my good friend Danny Abdeljabbar. What's up, man? How are you?
Chilling, man, as per usual. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty good, and we're excited to introduce our third co-host, our new co-host. So it is a trifecta now. Reginald, are you with us?
Unfortunately for you lot, yes, I'm still here. Seems I've been roped into this trifecta. Let's hope the other two can keep up, shall we?
Oh, burn. Sick burn, Reginald.
Well, someone has to keep the standards up around here. If I don't dish it out, who will?
Okay,
Okay.
we get it, Reginald.
All right.
Don't wear up your welcome right away. So, yeah, Reginald is here to help us with really just to add another perspective. He is from the United Kingdom, as you could tell by his accent. And yeah, he'll be here just listening and chiming in at some points. So make Reginald feel at home. And yeah, I think he's going to enhance our show.
Yeah, let's see.
Reginald, before we get started, just tell the audience, what are your favorite things?
Favourite things? Well, if I must indulge you, quiet afternoons, a good debate, and people who know when to shut up. As for them, probably sunshine, optimism, and other ghastly things that make me want to sigh audibly. Different strokes, I suppose.
Interesting.
Oh,
all right. I think
okay,
that's enough
Reginald.
Out of Reginald for now.
That's enough of you, Reginald. All right.
Yeah.
So we'll call on you later. Excuse us for our third co-host. It's a learning process. We're breaking him in.
He's onboarding. He's
onboarding. But
he's
onboarding. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm excited to speak with you. I'm excited for everyone to be listening today. We are talking about an interesting topic today, something that I didn't think we would be talking about, as in a couple of months ago, but it's such a weird topic and such a weird story that we just thought that you would find it interesting as well. And we're going to be talking about the Moors, aka the Moops.
The Moops? What are you talking about?
The Moops, man. You don't get Seinfeld, do you?
I watched many Seinfelds. When did they say the Moops?
So George is, I think he's playing some trivia game with the Bubble Boy.
Okay.
And they get into an argument over an answer, which is the Moors. The Bubble Boy says Moors, and there's like a smudge on the card, and it says Moops. So George is like, no, the correct answer was the Moops. And then Bubble Boy gets pissed off, and he's like, and then there's a whole fight between George and this guy with a horrible disability living inside of a bubble.
Okay. I guess I didn't see that. That's the reference. The Moops.
And you want to name it's so funny that you don't get Seinfeld because you want to name your child Seven.
That's correct. But I had this idea before I ever saw that episode, so.
You want to name your kid Seven.
That's correct.
And then you're like, yeah, but it's not because of Seinfeld. I don't really even watch it. And I'm like, that's going to be, well, you know what? It won't be a joke because no one's going to know what Seinfeld, that generation will not know what Seinfeld is. So it would be like bringing up a reference from like Happy Days today, you know?
Right,
like,
exactly.
Well, what?
Yeah.
The Fonz? Who's the Fonz?
Or like Cheers or some shit.
So,
yeah.
Yeah, Cheers. So, yeah, we're going to be talking about the Moors. So, to give a brief history, they were the Muslims in North Africa who conquered parts of Spain and Portugal in the 8th century. And it took the white Christian Europeans 800 years to expel them out of Europe. And they weren't a single homogenous group. It was, the term Moor was really just a way for Europeans to refer to them. So they referred to anyone from North Africa who was Muslim as a Moor. So it was this broad label for people coming out of places, what would be modern day Morocco or Algeria, Tunisia. They were a mix of Berbers, Arabs, and then there was some sub-Saharan Africans. And the term Moor, you don't really hear the term Moor anymore. It stopped being used sometime, between the 17th and 18th century, with really the rise of the modern nation state. There was a shift toward identifying people by their national or regional identities rather than these broad catch-all terms like the Moors. Also, the term Moor had very much been tied to the Iberian Peninsula and, the conflict between Christians and Muslim rulers. So once that era ended, the term really wasn't relevant anymore. And, especially when the boundaries between Christian and Muslim territories were being redrawn. So, given that, I was surprised to learn that Moors were living in America. And not as in like Moroccan immigrants are living in America, but the true descendants of the Moorish Empire are actually here. And they're not actually descendants of like the Berbers or anything like that. They're actually Black Americans who were the descendants of slaves. And why don't we break down the story?
Yeah, that's just scratching the surface. The group itself is called the Sovereign Citizens of the Moorish Empire, or the Moorish Sovereign Citizen Movement. So, backstory behind this, I caught this video by Vice a couple weeks back, and it got me thoroughly invested in this really long rabbit hole of criminal activity and conspiracy theories. So this is where all of this is coming from. So yeah.
I didn't know Vice still existed.
They just do like web series and stuff like that. Yeah.
So the first thing that comes to mind when you think of these Black nationalist groups, for me, it's the Black Hebrew Israelites, because we run into them from time to time in New York or within the tri-state area.
I saw them in Puerto Rico recently. So
what's that?
I saw them in Puerto Rico recently, actually. So
oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, really.
But they're these crazy guys who yell at people on the street, and they'll be like, "The white man is the devil." And
why does he sound like a Southerner?
His machinations are what leads to enslavement of humanity.
Right. Yeah.
And then he'll be like, "Everybody, and I want to tell you that Moses was black. What does it say in the Bible? Moses is black."
Show me the verse.
So, you run into those people from time to time. And in the tri-state area, New Jersey, a couple of years ago, there was some, and this is actually kind of a weird story that I don't want to get too deep into. Maybe we could speak about it at the end of the podcast. But I think people heard when this Black Hebrew Israelite murdered a couple of Jews, like some Jewish grocery store workers.
Yeah.
Up in, what town was it? Was it like outside of Hoboken? I know it was near either Hoboken or it was Jersey City. It was in Jersey City, I think. Mm-hmm. So there's this whole weird story behind that as well.
Yeah.
So that's what most people think of, or at least I think of when we think about these strange nationalist groups. How similar are they to
kind of same vibe? But different set of ideas and actions, though. So what I found particularly interesting about this group was that they are a sovereign citizens movement. And obviously, according to them, they say that the U.S. laws don't apply to them because they're allegedly the true heirs of ancient Moors. They're part of the empire somehow.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of sovereign citizen movements in American history. Essentially, sovereign citizens believe that they are sovereign and therefore not subject to government authority and don't need to pay taxes or regulations don't impact them. And they're known for using like these pseudo legal arguments and filing like fraudulent legal documents to get what they want. For example, there was this group in the 90s called the Republic of Texas, and their claim was that Texas was never legally annexed by the United States, and its members were citizens of the Republic of Texas, not the U.S. Thus, U.S. laws didn't apply to them.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, how does being part of the Moorish Empire, in quotes, exempt you from U.S. laws?
Well, first of all, it doesn't. So let's just get that part clear. But the reason why they believe it does is basically due to this super loose interpretation of treaties that were signed pretty much right after the U.S. declared independence. But I can get into that a bit later. Where I think, it gets really wild is how they apply that logic for their own personal gain. So it's one thing to, use the law for, to claim that they're sovereign citizens, but it's another thing entirely to start using it against other people for their own personal gain. So the Vice video, again, it kicks off with this wild story of a woman, again, New Jersey. A lot of crazy shit happens there. I could say that because I'm from New Jersey. Anyway, this woman's named Shanetta Little. She recently bought a home after dealing with obviously really tough real estate market. And before she could even settle into the home, something absolutely crazy happened. So this stranger breaks into her house, changes the locks, and then declares that it now belongs to him. And the reason, his justification for this, was that he was a Moorish sovereign citizen.
That's crazy. Well, this stuff always seems to happen in Jersey as of late.
Yeah.
So how did that transpire?
Well, I mean, according to this guy, he had these ancestral rights to the land based, again, on this 300-year-old treaty, meaning that now this home that Shanetta had just legally purchased wasn't hers. So because he had these ancestral rights to the land, her purchase was void. It wasn't real, legally speaking, according to this guy.
So it's kind of like Jewish settlers kicking out Palestinians of their homes in Jerusalem.
Ugh.
They use the religious claim that that Jews have a God-given right to the land, citing the Torah and old synagogues that were found in the area.
Mm-hmm.
But they also use legal arguments as well.
Yeah.
And what they'll say is that Israeli settlers or properties that were these are properties that were owned by Jews before 1948.
Mm-hmm.
And they will use Ottoman era land registrations to claim that Jews owned the land before the British Mandate.
Yeah.
And these arguments have a high success rate in Israeli court.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, what are these treaties that these, the Moorish Sovereign Citizen Movement, what are they using to justify their claims?
Okay, so according to the members of the Moorish Sovereign Citizen Movement, they're descendants of Moors, which we made clear, and their claims are loosely, again, based on a specific treaty, and the treaty is called the Treaty of Peace and Friendship, which was signed between the U.S. and the Sultan of Morocco in 1786, and that's, for those who are keeping count, that's less than 10 years after the U.S. declared independence. This was one of the earliest diplomatic agreements between the U.S. and a foreign power, which is pretty interesting. But the treaty didn't say all Moors get a free pass on breaking laws, right? The treaty established peaceful relations between the two nations, and it primarily focused on trade and maritime issues. But members of the Moorish Sovereign Movement today interpret the treaty as granting them special status within the U.S. And they believe that it exempts them from American laws and gives them right to land. And clearly this guy used the same exact claim, right? It's his ancestral heritage, basically. Now, I went and actually read the treaty because I do shit like that. And the only thing that I can find in there that kind of where I can kind of see where they're going with this is Article 6, and that reads, I'm quoting here, if any Moor shall bring citizens of the United States or their effects to his majesty, the citizen shall immediately be set at liberty and effects restored, and in like manner, if any Moor not a subject of these dominions shall make prize of any of the citizens of America or their effects, and bring them into any of the ports of his majesty, they shall be immediately released, as they will then be considered as under his majesty's protection. So obviously this is all written in 18th century English, so let me break that down for you. What it's saying is, if any Moor brings any U.S. citizen or their property to the Sultan of Morocco, presumably as a slave or as a captive, things like that, those citizens and or property will be set free and their belongings get returned to them. Similarly, if any non-Moroccan, so people outside of Morocco, captures a U.S. citizen or their property and brings them into a Moroccan port, they get freed immediately because they're under the Sultan's protection. Regardless of who you are, if you're going to Morocco and you have a captive U.S. citizen or, commandeered their property, it goes back to where it belongs. Now, you got to think about the context of this specific treaty, right? This is written in a time of slavery and piracy, right? So what this article protects against is the capture of U.S. citizens or their property by any Moor or anyone else who might go to a Moorish port.
So, if anything, it sounds like U.S. citizens should get special privileges in Morocco then, right?
Yeah, kind of. But this was in the late 17 and early 1800s. So, yeah, unfortunately, the last of these 25 articles, it spells out that the treaty would only last 50 years, and I'm pretty sure it's expired since then. So, I don't think I don't think they've renewed that. But yeah. The interpretation of that treaty, I think it goes way beyond the historical context there. In reality, the Treaty of Peace and Friendship, that was never about land ownership or personal sovereignty or the diplomatic status of Moors in the U.S. or vice versa. It was an agreement meant to protect American ships from piracy off the Barbary Coast. That's what it was. But to groups like this, this treaty is basically their like ticket to independence from U.S. jurisdiction. And even more crazy, they argue that their Moorish ancestries predates the establishment of the U.S. and therefore U.S. laws don't apply to them because they were around first, which is honestly just silly because by that argument, basically every American except for Native Americans would get the same benefits, right? If you're Henry, you're Polish and whatever the hell it is that you are, right? Those countries, those nationalities, those ethnic heritages predate the U.S. So according to their logic, shouldn't you also be exempt from U.S. laws, right? I don't think so. So,
I think their argument is that I think when we dive deeper into the subject, there's a lot of arguments. There's so many different kind of arguments that they present.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are that or pseudo histories that they present. Some of them is we were part of the Moorish Empire and then we came here through slavery. Some of them say things like we're actually native to the United States.
Oh, we'll get into that. Yeah.
But
don't let that cat out of the bag just yet.
But yeah, it's a wild claim.
You know what's crazy about this is that it's not just about some guy stealing property. It can get really dicey with these groups. In 2021, a similar movement that's in the same vein as the Moorish Sovereign Citizens, they actually were caught in a standoff with the police, like an armed standoff. Did you?
Yeah, I heard about that. I heard about that a couple of years ago.
Yeah. So the story there was that there were these 11 guys and they were heavily armed, and they were part of a group called the Rise of the Moors, who were traveling in just tactical gear, and they were on their way to apparently go to the training camp or something like that. And then the state police found them on the side of the road and obviously questioned them. There's 11 guys heavily armed to the teeth. They refused to show ID. And they also refused to show any permits for the weapons that they had. And obviously didn't sit well with the police, right? These guys are carrying long arms openly, and they're not showing any ID or any proof that they legally have the right to, have these weapons out in the open, right? And again, their defense was rooted in the idea that as sovereign citizens, the US laws don't apply to them, so they straight up refuse to comply. But now we're talking about two groups of people who have guns, right? So this turned into a very tense standoff, right? It was 9 hours long that they were basically standing off against each other. And it got live streamed, actually, which is pretty interesting. And then eventually they end up surrendering. All the men get taken into custody. Nobody got shot, thankfully. But it could have been a bloody mess with all the weapons that were on premise at that time, which is pretty wild.
Yeah, that is a completely insane story, and I'm surprised it didn't get bigger coverage than it did, because it's just so odd and out there.
I mean, media, cycle is so fast these days that like this was a blip in 2021. Like this.
Yeah, fair point.
That didn't even matter. So it's not just like these physical confrontations that I think are concerning too, because members of these types of movements often engage in what's called paper terrorism. And you kind of called it out in the beginning here, where they basically file things like fraudulent liens, legal documents, and lawsuits that are meant to basically overwhelm and intimidate their victims in the court system. And these tactics often they target law enforcement, government officials, and unfortunately, in the case of Shanetta, homeowners. And it creates this kind of like chaos that it puts them in a position to really solidify the belief in their own sovereignty. And for Shanetta, this nonsense turned her homeownership dream into, basically a nightmare. I mean, this guy physically took over her property. He sawed off the locks, moved in, and then held his ground on the property. Shanetta had to call in a SWAT team to forcibly remove him. Like, they had to call in a SWAT team, which is wild. And wild part about this is that he walked away without being charged. He was never charged. And he still maintains that, that land, and by extension, the house that's on that land, belongs to him through this Moorish ancestry. And this crazy scenario is it's not a one-off. It's part of this like larger pattern of all these property disputes and legal challenges that have been launched by the Moorish sovereign citizens movement across the US, and specifically has been increasing recently.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how many of these events have happened, because that's pretty wild. So where does this belief system come from? Like, how does this evolve into causing these sorts of problems?
Yeah, I mean, as crazy as this idea sounds now, these events are part of, I don't know, like a larger story. And it not only rewrites history, but it attempts to like reject modern governance, right? It's already a stretch to make the connection between the Moorish Empire and the Moorish Sovereign Citizens Movement, especially when you consider that they're, the thing that they're using to connect this is, legal immunity. Also, Moors are not a group of citizens in that way. So yeah, the Moors aren't like a people. It was a broad term, as you said in the beginning,
Yeah, there was actually no such thing as the Moorish Empire. There was never a centralized Moorish state, quote unquote. That's why I said Moorish Empire, in quote. It wasn't like the Romans or the Ottoman empires. It was just essentially like a coalition of territories and states that were ruled by Muslim dynasties, and they were Berbers and Arabs.
Mm-hmm.
And that treaty that the U.S. signed was with the Kingdom of Morocco.
Mm-hmm.
They were called Moors and they use the language Moors just because that's how Europeans refer to them.
Mm-hmm.
But, within the Sultanate themselves, they didn't describe themselves as Moors. Like, oh, we have the honor of the Moors.
Right.
They just described themselves as Muslims.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, this whole story gets super crazy. I went down this rabbit hole, trying to figure out like, where does all this stuff come from? And I ended up in a dark corner of YouTube watching these alt history videos and conspiracy theories that these groups are subscribing to or adjacent to. And what I learned kind of put their ideas into like a very strange perspective for me. So I came across this one video, and the video is called "Study Reveals Black Americans Aren't Descended from Black Slaves, but Hidden Native Original People." It's a mouthful of a title. What's crazy about this video is that it's been viewed over 274,000 times, right? And it's also, what's crazy about this video is that it's one of those like, AI robot voiceover videos.
like our podcast.
Yeah, just like Reginald, but don't invoke his name because he might jump in. So this video, it's been seen more than 250,000 times. The main claim is that Black Americans aren't really descended from African slaves, but they're instead native Black Americans who lived in America before Columbus arrived.
Well, there's actually a lot of Black nationalist movements that with these like really strange origin stories. Mm-hmm. So, Black Hebrew Israelites, who's kind of the poster child for it. So what they believe, and I actually have a book. Someone got this for me. It's like a joke. From Hebrews to Negroes. It's a book that makes all the historical arguments that Black Hebrew Israelites make. It's really interesting. But in a nutshell, what they believe that African Blacks are the true descendants of the ancient Israelites of the Bible, and that the original Hebrews were Black. And over time, the descendants of these biblical Israelites were scattered across the world during the slave trade. Thus, Black people in the Americas and the Caribbean are the true heirs to the covenant with God, and they're the lost tribe of Israel. And that's like a common theme, because that's Rastafarians believe something very similar as well.
Yeah, they do. Mm-hmm.
And then there's other nations too, and a lot of these are kind of like derivatives of each other. But there's a group called like the Washita Nation, and they claim to be the descendants of an ancient indigenous Black civilization that lived in North America long before European colonization. And they originally lived in the Mississippi Valley.
Right.
And they were part of the southern United States. And that their ancestors were not slaves brought from Africa, but rather an ancient group of people who were already here before the landing of Columbus. So you have groups like that. And then Nation of Islam has some real... Nation of Islam is really interesting. Like, I actually kind of... I don't want to say I have a soft spot for the Nation of Islam, but I do find their history really, really interesting. And I will say that Nation of Islam, I don't know so much anymore, but at one point they actually had some really smart scholars involved there. But their founder, F.D. Fard, he preached that basically the Black race were the descendants of the lost tribe of Shabazz.
Shabazz?
And the lost tribe of Shabazz.
Okay.
And they were an ancient people, and they were basically the original black civilization. And, what he would teach is that white people were the race of the devils who were created through like a genetic experiment by this Black scientist named Yaqub. And Yaqub is like this god-like entity. He's essentially a deity.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like all this, and I don't think most of them believe this, but it's like there's all this like weird mythology that's also inserted into Islam that makes it something that's really different from like, what a Sunni or a Shia believe. But it's just these, weird kind of derivatives from the religion. But yeah, I mean, what they were originally teaching is that American Blacks must reject the false teachings of Christianity, which in turn were used to subjugate them, and that's why that they needed to embrace Islam as the true religion, because Christianity was a tool of subjugation. So there's like all this kind of weird mythology behind the Nation of Islam, but then there's stranger groups as well. So there's a group called the Nuwaubian Nation. You've heard about this, right?
Yes, I have.
The Nuwaubian Nation, and they have this. I don't think they have it anymore, but at one point they had this like really big compound like outside of Atlanta, like this weird cult compound.
Okay.
Like the Clearwater Fortress in probably not as nice, but the Clearwater like Scientologist Fortress, and they're actually an offshoot of the Nation of Islam. And because all these groups have these weird offshoots, like they're really not centralized. There's no like Pope of Farrakhan is what, 1 million years old?
Yeah.
So they believed that they were the descendants of the ancient Nubians. So the Nubians being, peoples who lived in North Africa and Egypt, and they linked their identity to, through the Nubians to Islamic teachings, but they also took their lineage from the Moors as well. So they had like the rightful claim to Moorish identity. But as time went on, and like these groups, as they have different leaders and stuff, they kind of adapt different stories. They started to really adopt a much stranger belief that moved away from Islam, drawing more so on like Egyptian mythology, where they became like the descendants of ancient Egypt. And then they had this really, really strange leader named Dwight York in the 90s. And this guy's like a convict. I'm pretty sure he's in jail right now. But he so basically he started preaching that black people were the descendants of these extraterrestrial beings. So they came from different planets.
I mean, obviously, I'm going to want to jump in on this, right? This is 100% my area. Such a sucker for alien shit. Okay. According to their leader, these guys, Dwight York is his name. The Anunnaki are ancient extraterrestrials from the planet Nibiru, which is this mysterious planet that enters Earth's solar system in these long elliptical orbits. I don't remember the exact time period, but it's like every 3,700 years or something like that. Nibiru is home to these highly advanced beings who have had direct involvement in shaping human history, according to how it goes. The Anunnaki were responsible for everything from creating humanity to everything in between. And they allegedly came to Earth thousands of years ago and genetically engineered early humans, specifically black people, to serve as a labor force. And the Anunnaki manipulated the DNA of the Earth's primitive, hominids, creating the first humans who were coincidentally originally dark-skinned beings. And so this is where it's tying into the, these origin stories. Now, the Anunnaki allegedly have visited Earth multiple times throughout history, influencing, human civilization, particularly in Africa and the Middle East. And the ancient advanced civilizations like Egypt and Sumer and Nubia are seen as being directly influenced by Anunnaki technology and wisdom. Personally, I'm kind of into that theory. I think it's pretty interesting. But they also believe things like, the pyramids were built, or other ancient monuments were built by the Anunnaki, or at the very least with their assistance. And as the story goes, the Anunnaki will return to Earth in the near future to, mess around with human affairs and restore balance again. And they're going to help elevate consciousness or something, especially those folks who are, in line with the Anunnaki lineage. And of course, groups like the Nubian nation believe that they are, these direct descendants. So they'll get the special treatment when the aliens come back.
Let's ask Reginald what he thinks about this.
Oh, splendid aliens and conspiracies. Just what I needed. The Anunnaki? Well, they're part of ancient Sumerian mythology, and some have taken that and spun it into wild theories involving extraterrestrial DNA and hidden histories. The Nubian nation, you say? They've taken that to a whole other level, mixing it with some sci-fi and spiritualism to claim alien ancestry. Frankly, it's all a bit too much, isn't it? As if human history isn't fascinating enough without dragging in extraterrestrial genetics. I imagine it gives some people a sense of importance, but I can't say it does much for me. I'd rather stick to history where we actually have evidence, not cosmic soap operas.
Yeah, I can't say it better myself. What do you think, Henry?
Reginald, I think you're right.
Sorry, I'm having issues right now.
Oh, okay. Never
Could not
mind.
understand what you said.
Of course.
Okay. Whatever. You have one moment of inspiration and then you decide you don't want to contribute anymore. I got it. Let's move on.
Okay, so so we went off the rails a little bit, thanks to Reginald. But let's get back to that video on the theory that Black people are the true indigenous peoples of the Americas. Are there any? Because I haven't watched these videos. What are their claims? Like, how do they back this up?
Yeah. So according to the video, that obviously they're saying that the history has been covered up by the U.S. government to prevent Black Americans from claiming reparations and land rights like how the Native Americans do today. So let's break down these claims. And also, let's see why they don't add up. So the first claim is that Black Americans are actually descendant of Native Black Americans. So it kicks off by suggesting that, this traditional narrative of the transatlantic slave trade is wrong. And so instead of African Americans being descended from African slaves, it claims that they're actually the descendants of Native Black Americans who were originally shipped out of America and then brought back to America as African slaves. Are you following that?
All right, go on.
Uh-huh. So, obviously,
I'm listening.
The facts don't support this at all. And I can't even believe we have to fact check it. So let's take a look at DNA evidence, right? The DNA evidence shows that the vast majority of African Americans have predominantly African ancestry. It's around 73%. And a tiny fraction, less than 1%, have Native American DNA. And so this genetic data combined with obviously the extensive historical documentation, including shipping manifests, which are pretty abundant, it very clearly proves that most Black Americans are indeed descendants of Africans who were brought to the Americas through this, the transatlantic slave trade from Africa. Their argument against this, which is just crazy as hell, is, that's true. Lots of people were brought from Africa to the Americas, but first they were in the Americas. They brought them back over to Africa, and then they took them from Africa and brought them back to America. And that's why you see the shipping manifests. This is literally what they're trying to say. It is fucking wild.
Yeah, it's really something.
So there's more claims. So, okay. Second claim that they make. Tens of millions of native Black Indians were shipped to Europe and Africa. So this is that claim. And, it's that apparently native Black Indians who were in America at the time were captured and shipped to Europe and Africa, and only a fraction of them were brought back as African slaves. So it's just reversing that trade narrative. So there's obviously no evidence to back that up. And, while Native Americans, actual Native Americans were enslaved in some areas during colonial times, the numbers were far smaller than those, of the African slave trade. Documented transatlantic slave trade involved about 12.5 million Africans, with around 10.7 million that ended up actually surviving the journey. So a lot of people died just on the boat ride over. And the scale of Native American enslavement, it's a drop in the bucket compared to how many Africans were enslaved, or even what the claims were made in this video. Now, of course, if you ask them, they'll probably say, oh, it's because you're being lied to by the government, right? That those aren't real numbers. So, okay, I guess, I don't believe it, but I guess. All right, so third claim.
From my perception, the way that most colonial governments behaved is that most of the slaves were imported from like these designated hot like slave spots.
Mm-hmm.
In most of those were like in West Africa, like
right.
in Ghana was like a big one.
Mm-hmm.
And
what is now Liberia,
even in South,
it was a huge exporter.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, but if you look at South Africa, the Dutch, when they first arrived in 1652, they didn't enslave the black population there, but they had slaves. And what they did is that they warred, they effectively eradicated the local tribe that was on the Cape Colony.
Right.
But they went the race down there went extinct. However, they didn't enslave them because they were like, if we enslave them, it's just going to cause way too much hostility across other tribes, and it's just going to make our life hell. So all of their slaves were imported from. I mean, in South Africa is a unique case because it's actually far away from the major slave ports.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of their slaves came from like Mozambique and a lot of the slaves in South Africa weren't even black slaves. They were from like India and Indonesia and places like that. But from what I've read, and maybe I'm wrong about this, that colonial governments did not, they worked to not enslave the native populations. They warred with them and killed them, but and in some cases genocided them, but they wouldn't enslave them. Usually their goal was just to ethnically cleanse them to other parts of ethnically cleanse them until they ended up in reservations.
Yeah. Tragic. Seriously. We're getting a little off topic. How do we get to South Africa from there? I forgot.
Oh yeah, just because you're saying that they were making claims that the natives were enslaved.
Right. Well, that's natives in America, not natives in Africa. That's slightly different. Okay, so here's an interesting one. The third claim, which gained popularity thanks to a book by Ivan van Sertima called "They Came Before Columbus," claimed that Africans were in the Americas before Columbus, and they influenced Native American cultures. So they were there first. What do you think about that?
Go on. I want to hear. I don't know what to think. I want to hear. I want to hear what they have to say. Well, I mean, come on. They're not the first people to make that claim. The Mormons say that the Israelites came to America.
Yeah, I don't know if the Book of Mormon is a credible source, but I hear you. I mean, there's also like the Nordic idea, like that there was probably Vikings in, like Canada and Newfoundland and Labrador and shit like that. Like there's
that's basically
Erickson.
Like proven at this point, right? Like the Vikings definitely had expeditions to Newfoundland, right? But they just didn't make permanent settlements.
Yeah, they didn't make permanent settlements. What these people are saying that believe these theories are saying that a lot of the larger African empires in sub-Saharan African empires, that is, they were indeed very advanced, probably more advanced than a lot of history books will let on, and I'll give them that. And they said that they had fantastic capabilities, specifically in maritime capabilities. And I'd be open to the idea that they sailed across the sea and maybe engaged with, some trade or dialogue communication with people in the Americas. I think that's a possibility. I don't think that's impossible.
Well, didn't I'm speaking hey, let's ask Reginald right now.
Okay. Hang
He
on.
might know this. Were the descendants of the Polynesian islands from Africa?
Of the Polynesian islands?
Yeah, like didn't the Africans sail to Polynesia?
Not
Or
that
they
I'm,
weren't. Maybe I'm wrong. I just want to hear.
yeah, not that I'm familiar
We'll
with.
just hear the robot say. I don't know
Okay.
anything about the Polynesian history.
Oh, we're diving into the wild waters of speculative history now, are we? No, the Polynesians aren't descended from Africans, nor is there any credible evidence to suggest that Africans sailed to Polynesia in ancient times. The genetic and archaeological evidence clearly shows that the Polynesians originated from Austronesian-speaking peoples who migrated from Taiwan through island Southeast Asia and Melanesia before spreading across the Pacific. That said, there have been some far-flung contact theories between Polynesians and other peoples, including Native Americans, with evidence suggesting possible interactions around the year 1200 AD. But Africans, no, that's pure fantasy. You'll find more credible stories in a children's book. Stick to what the evidence says. Polynesians were master navigators, but their genetic roots are firmly in East Asia and the Pacific. Enough with the fanciful ideas.
Okay, but what about Africans or African empires that might have sailed to the Americas? Isn't that possible? Or is there any evidence to suggest that maybe they are?
Ah, here we go again, African empires sailing to the Americas. Now, there's always a romantic allure to the idea that someone else beat Columbus to the punch, and in some cases that's actually true. But when it comes to African civilizations reaching the Americas, evidence is rather thin. The most common story tied to this theory involves the Mali Empire, particularly under the rule of Mansa Abu Bakari II, who allegedly set sail with a massive fleet to explore the Atlantic in the early 14th century. According to some accounts, he abdicated the throne to do so, though none of the ships returned. This tale has sparked speculation that they might have reached the Americas, but there's no hard evidence. No archaeological finds, no artifacts that can definitively connect the dots between Mali and pre-Columbian America. Then there are theories involving Olmec heads, which some people claim resemble African features. However, most scholars chalk this up to artistic interpretation rather than actual contact between African civilizations and Mesoamerican cultures. So, while it's a tantalizing possibility that makes for good storytelling, the historical and archaeological record doesn't support the idea that African empires made significant contact with the Americas before Europeans arrived. Speculation? Sure. Solid evidence? Not really.
Geez, Reginald, are you going to put me out of a job pretty soon? What do you think about that response, Henry?
I'm gonna have to go with Reginald.
Yeah, I think so too. So, I mean,
He made me feel like a real dumbass though before. So about the Africans navigating to Polynesian islands, but
Yeah.
whatever.
Okay. Okay. So back to this theory, right? Reginald pretty clearly described that there's not enough credible evidence that would suggest that they have actually been there. So we'll go to the last claim in this video, which is that the U.S. government is basically hiding the story, right? So that they can avoid reparations. So this argument is that if Black Americans knew that they had Native ancestry, that they could demand land and reparations as part of their indigenous heritage. And the reason why they have that theory is because, and I don't know why they're going this route, because unfortunately, even till today, we don't really treat the Native Americans very well at all, right? Like, yeah, they have their own independent enclaves and reservations, and for the most part, they self-govern, but they're still pretty subjugated and oppressed in a lot of different ways. So I have no idea why they think that it's a good idea to side with these folks or pretend that they are in that group. Their argument is that they ought to be able to carve out their own reservations, make their own governments, do all their own things. And if and the government doesn't want that. So yeah, that's what they're trying to say.
Hey, it's called freedom of association. If you want to, create your own city state effectively, or state within it, or sovereign area, I'm not against that.
Well, I mean,
The
that's
native
precisely what they're trying
tribes
to do.
have some very serious problems, but the problems they face are it's they're extremely complex. I'm just saying, like, in the modern sense.
Mm-hmm.
Let alone, there's high rates of drug addiction, and there's high rates of alcoholism in native communities, but there's like a lot of like perverse funding incentives and reservations.
Mm-hmm.
There's like a lot of like regulations and tape they have to go through. If you look at like studies of natives who are in the reservation system and natives outside of the reservation system, natives outside of the reservation system are just like everyone, like they do as well as anyone else, basically. But natives inside the reservation system, it's like, it's a fucked up situation.
Yeah. And there's deep and complex reasons for that we probably shouldn't go into because we haven't done enough research on that. But I think it's wild, I think, to use that as a route because if you just look at the reservations as an example, the actual native reservations, they're not getting this, sweet deal. You know what I mean? Like they're not getting this awesome thing. So it's just not, in my opinion, like a good strategy, right? And also, I mean, just to be clear, the claim falls apart really quickly. All you got to do is look at DNA testing, right, and historical records, and just like, I don't know, common sense, and you would find no credible reason for a cover up, right? You could discuss reparations for African Americans in general. I think that's fair to talk about. And most of those discussions focus around compensating for the lasting impacts of slavery or Jim Crow laws or systemic racism. And that's all on the table. But like, nobody's like putting Black people down for having a hidden Native ancestry. There's no basis for that claim. It's just weird. It's a strange angle.
Yeah, I don't know where they're going with that one, but it is, a lot of this is just, it kind of strains from many of the other topics that we talk about, how creating a national identity that goes back to ancient times legitimizes your national movement or your sovereign movement or whatever, your identity movement.
Mm-hmm.
You see this with like with so many different cultures, like
Yeah.
especially in the 20th century where it became a big phenomenon. But we talked about how we talked a lot about Ukraine on this podcast, and a lot of the hardcore Ukrainian nationalists, they basically believe that they're these like descendants of these Nordic, they're like the real first proto-Slavs who are the descendants of Nordic Vikings who sailed down the Volga River and founded this great empire, the Kievan Rus. The Kievan Rus was a real country, was a real state, but there's like this real mythology surrounding the Kievan Rus, and also in Russian history as well, because it is like the when the Kievan Rus split up, that was the Duchy of Moscow was a derivative of it. But every culture has that. Like, fascist Italy tried to link its heritage back to Rome. Even Irish people, try to, they link themselves back to the Celtic people.
Yeah.
The Celtics are an ancient group. The modern day Israelis or Jews, they link themselves back to the ancient Hebrews.
Or a
and
lot
the
of
ancient
the
Hebrews
Asians.
are, we don't really know we know who the ancient Hebrews were, but the Jews that settled Israel in the 20th century, or 19th and 20th, mainly the 20th century, there was a lot of things that happened in that region, and there's a lot of it's very cloudy to trace yourself back to like a biblical or ancient homeland.
Well, I mean, we talk a lot
But
about this
it's
on the show.
imperative. It's really important when it comes to creating a consciousness, like a community consciousness.
Right. We talk a lot about this on the show. I mean, we have episodes on the origins of specific peoples. I think back to our one on the origins of the Japanese people and how they think about they need this ancient, super old connection to legitimize their current claims, right? The Chinese do that, although in fairness, the Chinese can probably make that claim because they do have a long, unbroken chain. But more often than not, when you see a lot of these ancient claims to fame, so to speak, there's a lot of, like you said, it's cloudy, right? There's a lot of breaks, there's a lot of questions. And now with the introduction of stuff like DNA, it kind of really throws a wrench in those ideas. But nevertheless, these conspiracy theorists they're not interested in the science or the hard facts. They need an identity, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think in doing research for this podcast today, I really wanted to talk more about the actual Moorish Empire, or the loose collection of Moors that ultimately invaded the Iberian Peninsula, because I get the feeling that this Moorish Empire is super important to European history, but it doesn't really get covered a lot. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. So the real Moorish Empire, if we're going to call it that for ease sake, it was a very sophisticated civilization, and it made really significant contributions to things like science and architecture and agriculture and education throughout the entire time that they reigned over the Iberian Peninsula, from 711 to, about 1492, when they were expelled in the Reconquista. But the Moors, they were instrumental in preserving and advancing knowledge from classical civilizations, which later fueled European Renaissance. They introduced things like Arabic numerals, so the numbers that we use today, right? Before we were using like fucking Roman weirdo VII. What is that? 7? They introduced a little thing called algebra. Also, a lot of agricultural practices, which were super important for the European economy, right? They had so many architectural innovations. Two that come to mind are the Alhambra and the Great Mosque of Cordoba, which till today are still standing, and you can go visit them. And they are incredibly well built, and they're very, very artistic. And I think a lot of the architecture styles in the Iberian Peninsula, so places like Portugal and Spain, they draw a lot of inspiration from that. So a lot of these places that we go to that are, we're so charmed by the, European cute look, a lot of that got influenced by the Moors and their architectural innovations. And, the Moors, like we've said earlier on the show, they're not like a specific peoples, right? They're a diverse coalition. Arabs, Berbers, African Muslims, some sub-Saharan Africans as well. And they basically came over to the Iberian Peninsula in 711 when Tariq ibn Ziyad led their army across the Strait of Gibraltar. And that invasion was not just a military endeavor, but also it would become the beginning of what was called the Al-Andalus, which is a period of like 800 years of Moorish influence in modern day Spain and Portugal. And, they basically spanked the Visigoth kingdom that was in the Iberian Peninsula at the time. They were weakened really by internal divisions before they even came over, but they just made quick work of them. And over time, they expanded their control over almost the entire peninsula. At their height, the Moors transformed that peninsula into basically the cultural and intellectual center of Europe. I mean, Cordoba was one of the most advanced cities in medieval Europe at the time. And by the 10th century, Cordoba was home to things like a massive library that had hundreds of thousands of books. And it became a leader in science and medicine and philosophy. Also, and this is so important because Westerners really look up to Greek and Roman scholars, and writings, the Moors were absolutely instrumental in preserving their works. They translated those works into Arabic and then later into Latin, which allowed that knowledge to spread across Europe and eventually fuel the Renaissance. It's easy to argue that if they hadn't, that a lot of the foundations that we draw from Greek and Roman antiquity would just not really be as popular or as broad or as widespread as it is today. Also, I can't underscore the agricultural innovations because they made these really advanced irrigation systems, and it allowed the Moors to cultivate a lot of different crops in the peninsula, like rice and oranges and lemons and sugarcane, in the specifically arid climate of southern Spain, and that wealth sustained the local population, but it became a key export to the rest of Europe. So now not only are they feeding the people there, but they're exporting all those goods and they're creating commerce, and that commerce spreads ideas, and you can imagine how that spirals out. I mean, it can keep going on and on and on about the math and astronomy and all kinds of fun stuff, but I'm sure you're probably getting bored by this point. So I don't know. I just think that the legacy of the Moors is something that just doesn't get talked a lot about. And, the idea that, I don't know, Black Americans today are, indigenous people that might be, connected to the Moorish Empire. Like, it's understandable why Black communities today seek to create a shared cultural identity. I mean, African Americans endured centuries of displacement and oppression. So, making a sense of belonging, yeah, I mean, that makes sense. But I think this idea that, we need to, it becomes like really problematic when groups like the Moorish Sovereign Citizen Movement, they distort the very rich history of the Moorish Empire to support their legal claims and stealing people's houses. Like that's like a bridge too far. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, obviously that is unacceptable to make land claims based off pseudo history, and it's just the Moorish Empire. I mean, I find the word Moorish Empire itself a little ahistorical because again, there was no Moorish Empire. It was just a different sultanates.
Mm-hmm.
In different different kind of fiefdoms that did contribute a lot to the world, but it's a catch-all. It's a people can. It's like saying that Germany was united in the under like the Holy Roman Empire or
Mm-hmm.
something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But even less so because like at least the Holy Roman Empire had an elected. They elected an empire,
Mm-hmm.
an emperor, but all the different states and provinces and stuff in the Holy Roman Empire were self-governed essentially.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't act as like one unified nation or anything. So there was no like Moorish ruler. There was different sultanates, different Berber kings, basically.
Right.
So I'll just throw that into it. But yeah, I hear a lot of stuff on the like, oh, whites built everything. Like white, all cultural achievements are from whites,
right,
and Europeans. And yeah, Europeans have contributed a lot to economic, political, industrial development in the world, but don't pretend like there hasn't been like cultural centers and economic centers haven't shifted throughout history, because when the first civilizations that obviously come out of the Middle East and North Africa, these centers, these cultural centers, like these prosperous centers, they tend to shift over around the world or at different times. So I don't abide to the argument that, oh yeah, like all civilization is due to Western European civilization. It's cultural center shift, and
They absolutely do. And
yeah.
to be more like sharp against that argument, I mean, I've just pointed out how the Moors basically advanced European society. Yeah, we wouldn't have the numbers that we have, or the math that we have, or even just the free access to ideas like democracy that came from the ancient Greeks, because it was the Moors, or broadly the Muslims, who translated those ideas into languages that the Europeans could understand.
I will also say there was a reason why it took 800 years for the Europeans to
kick out the Moors.
Expel them out of the
yeah,
to kick them out.
It's like a really good reason,
but,
actually.
yeah, there's a reason why the Reconquista was 800 years, and there would be a century where they would maybe get like a mile of land,
right?
Right. But the I know in Europe today, I don't know if you want to segue this into like modern politics or
Sure.
modern, or if you still want to talk about the history or not.
No, I'm good. We can talk about some modern stuff.
Oh yeah, I just so now in Europe, we don't really see this as much in the United States, because most of the migrants that come to America are from Latin America, but there's obviously like these huge migration problems in Europe, across like the UK and Germany, and France, and I'm against mass migration as well. I think mass migration is very harmful to a country. However, you hear a lot of these like guys who've been pushed real far to the right, and there's like, oh, the barbarians are invading.
Right.
Whites invented everything in the world, and like you just want to, you couldn't build any civilization, so you're just coming to white
Steal
civilization
ours, right?
because we have stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, modern civilization was primarily kind of spearheaded by Europeans, but cultural centers have shifted over time,
and they can shift again.
So a lot of people fall into kind of like the hardcore racial trap that way. I think you're seeing that more so in America too, but more so in Europe right now. Even though I'm not European, so it's impossible for me to understand the zeitgeist there, just not being from there, or not kind of dealing with the day to day. But it is you see, I'm seeing like a lot of dehumanizing language out of the European, out of a lot of European right wingers, and I get it. I understand like mass migration is very destabilizing. It can be very destabilizing, but like don't call these people animals and stuff and barbarians, because at one point the cultural centers weren't in Europe. They were primarily based in North Africa and the Middle East, and of course in Asia, in China, and, advanced culturals were there as well.
We're sitting on the high horse now, but at any point, in the future, it might be that maybe it shifts to China, like they've been saying forever. I doubt it'll be anytime soon.
I mean, it'd be shifting back to China after a long hiatus.
Right, exactly. But it's reality. It's within the realm of possibility. So, like, this idea of superiority, I agree with you. I think it's primarily a nationalist offshoot. It's primarily a right wing offshoot. We see the same thing happening in the U.S. too. There's groups of very extreme right wingers that call South American migrants all the names in the book, and I find that disgusting as well. I can appreciate the concern of mass migration as you do, but I think there's better ways to discuss that than to just totally dehumanize groups of people. I think you're absolutely right on that.
But yeah, those are just my 2 cents. Reginald, how do you think how much have you been listening to this podcast? How did we do today?
Oh, where to begin? This episode was a veritable feast of far-fetched ideas, revisionist history, and wishful thinking. People in the US claiming to be part of the Moorish Empire. Well, it's a fascinating example of cultural reinterpretation, often rooted in a desire for connection to a glorified past. But let's be clear, the actual Moorish Empire was centered on North Africa and parts of Iberia, and there's no evidence of it stretching across the Atlantic to encompass the Americas. This modern-day reinterpretation is more a blend of myth, legal fiction, and identity politics than actual history. As for the idea that Africans went to Polynesia or the Americas before Columbus, it's an interesting what-if scenario. But as we covered, the hard evidence is still lacking. I appreciate Henry's enthusiasm, but we mustn't let imagination outrun the facts. All in all, I'd say this episode was a whirlwind of speculative history. You tackled big, juicy topics that keep people entertained, even if the conclusions are a bit shaky. But hey, at least you're getting people to think, which is more than most manage. Just make sure you don't take a detour into outright historical fantasy without acknowledging the evidence, or lack thereof.
Thank you, Reginald. A very astute observation.
Hey, honestly, I think he kind of sums up the show pretty well.
Yeah, really does.
Speculative history. All right. Well, Reginald, maybe we'll bring you back next episode. You were kind of a dick to me at some points, but you did bring something to the table. We did enjoy it. I don't know. In the reviews, so if you rate and review the podcast, in the review section, say 5 stars, I liked Reginald. 1 star, I hate you guys, stop doing the podcast. So 5 star is going to get more, probably 1 stars. 5 stars, you liked Reginald and you want him to continue joining the show. And 1 star for fuck you guys, I hate your podcast, and you should all just become, janitors because you have no talent. So do that. Also, Substack is where it's at. Did not mean to rhyme, but we are setting up our Substack. It's active, so all of our podcast episodes are released on the Substack, and they're ad-free. So there's an incentive to listen to them if you don't want to have an ad. And we also are posting articles. Articles are being worked on, so there's going to be a bunch of stuff that's going to be published on it. And I think it is a really good way. There's like a chat feature on it as well. So those who were subscribed to the Slack group that ran out of memory, this is the alternative to that very exciting Slack group that we had. So join the Patreon. Join the Substack. And anything else, Danny?
You can also comment on our YouTube videos. All of these get posted there too, but you're gonna have to suffer through the ads unless you pay for YouTube Premium. So let us know what you think.
All right, peace, guys.
See ya.